that's so it goes, as Kurt Vonnegut said. In any event, the important thing for us is when we have these ecstatic, spiritual, altered states of consciousness of one kind or the other, to then be able to integrate as much of what we have experienced there into our everyday consciousness and to be able to have it here with us and to utilize it with us. This is why certain very profound trance conditions, such as, let us say, were common in certain forms of spiritualism, which later on became channeling, and heaven knows what other name it's going to have now in the new millennium. It's always by whatever you call, whichever way you slice it, it's still the same baloney, as somebody said in the delicatessen. In any event, it's still the same thing. Is because, and I've been around those things. We all investigated those things at one time or the other. I mean, a medium in a real deep trance and comes back doesn't know anything of what went on. Other people are there who listen to what the medium says, write it down or something. As a Sufi teacher, Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan said once when I was there, the trouble with the mediumistic trance is that it's like a telephone. And the telephone does not enlarge its own consciousness, no matter who spoke through the telephone. Whether it could be Einstein speaking to the telephone, but once he hangs up, the telephone is just as dumb an instrument as it was before. So that tells you something about mediums and channelers. What I'm trying to indicate is it's the kind of altered state of consciousness which does not redound very much to the benefit of that particular individual. It may redound to the if the communications were interesting, it may redound to the benefit of others, but not to the person himself. And the magician is entirely different. The magical tradition, perhaps more than any other, perhaps even more than alchemy, although it's so many things about alchemy are so mysterious that we have very little information as to what kind of altered states of consciousness the alchemists experienced, but certainly there was a lot of it there. It was very colorful and it was very interesting. They did manage to write down a lot of things, but certainly the magician's principal trust has always been to remain conscious and to absorb into consciousness what has been experienced. So the magic that I'm talking about is ceremonial magic. Like alchemy, it was inherited, I think, by our culture primarily from Middle Eastern origins, and probably its principal seats of activity were Egypt, which was, of course, the home of the gods and regarded as the most powerful, the most mysterious place of them all by everyone. Even the Greeks respected the Egyptians in all matters spiritual tremendously. And possibly to some degree ancient Persia, ancient Iran also. And from these we have inherited the various forms of ceremonial magic. Now, one way of explaining the procedures of ceremonial magic is according to the three stages. This comes from the Renaissance period, which have to do with the vision, conversation, and union. And the way that has usually been explained is that there is a greater reality, which in this case is personified. We are talking here about high magic, angel magic primarily. And so often in Renaissance magic and subsequently, this was called the vision, conversation, and union with the holy guardian angel. Now, this holy guardian angel is, of course, a Judeo-Christian term, but it has antecedents in pagan antiquity by way of, let's say, a spiritual entity, the daimon or daimonion, which is not to be confused with a demon, who, or let's say, was very well known to the ancient Greeks and people of that sort. The famous stories about Socrates, for instance, that he had that entity, the daimon, who was telling him what to do. This can be envisioned in a variety of ways. It can be envisioned as a kind of higher counterpart, the spiritual self of ourselves. It can be understood as a spirit entity that has some special relationship to the individual. We don't really know. But once the gods and the goddesses and the daimons were, let's say, exorcised from the culture by the coming of Christianity, then it had to be called something. And the gods and the goddesses came to be called angels. Because in the monotheistic religions, it's the angelology that takes the place of the polytheistic pantheon. See, again, every religion worth its salt recognized that there is more to religion than just me and God. But let's say the polytheistic religions postulate the devata, as the Hindus would call them, the deities, and the Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians and so forth had the gods and the goddesses, but the monotheistic religions have the various hierarchies of angels, angels and archangels and cherubim and seraphim and thrones and dominions and so on and so forth, which are the spiritual entities that exist between the deity and the human. So in any event, enlargement of consciousness, union with the spiritual self, whatever you wish to call it. The personal self is often envisioned as having a fourfold structure, like a square. And whether you put there the four Jungian functions of the ego, such as thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, or whether you call it anything else, that's sort of the fourfold structure, the castle of our lower selfhood. And then there is another which is often envisioned as a Trinitarian, and that is the holy guardian angel, or the greater self, or the archetypal selfhood. The first thing that the magician says, you have to be able to get a glimpse of it. You have to envision it, and this is where the imagination comes into the picture. So in the high magic, the angel magic, whatever, invocational magic as you call it, that is the sort of thing that happens at first. In any kind of ceremonial magical operation, and the models that I'm using now would be primarily, let's say, the sort of things that probably were pretty much codified in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and then came down from then on. Just like the alchemist, the magician does a great deal of preparatory praying. Now that sounds pretty bad because, in our secular culture we all know that prayer is something that only the fundamentalists do, whatever the case may be. Well, I got news for you, that there has been prayer around long before there has been a Jerry Falwell and a Pat Robertson, and God help us, prayer will be around after those rascals are off the television screen and off the face of this earth. This may give you a little idea that I don't have a tremendous amount of love for those kinds of gentlemen, but what means there is a way of addressing the deeper realities of of putting forth the intention of asking for the proper state of consciousness, which will allow us to get a glimpse of that other, of that greater reality. And then, when those things are completed, there are various ceremonial procedures. And they are not that much different whether we are dealing with invocational or angel magic or evocational magic, which is of a less exalted character. But there is always a circle of protection of some kind or the other for the